What's a widely debated religious icon in the spotlight? The Shroud of Turin, which some believe to be the actual burial cloth.
For nearly 7 centuries, a piece of linen locked away in an Italian cathedral has sparked more controversy than perhaps any other religious artifact on Earth.
Praise before a 14-foot-long, ancient linen cloth.
The Shroud of Turin bears the haunting image of a crucified man, and millions believe it wrapped the body of Jesus Christ himself.
If it isn't human, it certainly isn't Jesus. That it was wrapping a corpse. That's the crux of the problem. The face is hidden in there.
But is it a sacred relic from the 1st century or an elaborate medieval forgery? Recent DNA tests and cutting-edge scientific analysis claim to finally have answers, though those answers might be more complicated than anyone expected.
Some say all that matters is whether you believe in it.
What exactly is the Shroud of Turin? The shroud itself is a rectangular linen cloth measuring about 14 feet long and 3.5 feet wide. What makes it extraordinary isn't just its size, but the faint sepia-toned image it carries, the front and back of a bearded man, hands folded, bearing wounds consistent with Roman crucifixion. You can see marks that look like scourging across the back, puncture wounds around the head as if from thorns, and what appears to be a spear wound in the side. The image is strangely photographic, more detailed in some areas than others, and it becomes clearer the farther away you stand from it. For believers, these aren't just marks, they're the sites, they're the physical evidence of Christ's passion. For skeptics, they're proof of remarkable artistry. The cloth has been kept in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy since 1578, displayed only on rare occasions, and protected behind bulletproof glass when shown to the public. The Catholic Church has never officially declared it authentic, but hasn't dismissed it either, instead calling it an important devotional object worthy of veneration. That careful neutrality hasn't stopped centuries of passionate debate. The medieval debut. Where did it come from? The shroud's documented history begins rather abruptly in 1354, when a French knight named Geoffroy de Charny presented it to a church in the small town of Lirey, France. De Charny never explained where he got it, which immediately raised eyebrows. Within decades, the local bishop declared it a forgery, claiming an artist had confessed to painting it, though no record of this artist or confession has ever been found. The controversy didn't stop the cloth from becoming a pilgrimage sensation. After changing hands through noble families, it eventually came into the possession of the House of Savoy, who moved it to their capital in Turin in 1578, where it remains today. The gap before 1354 is where things get murky and speculation runs wild. Some claim it's the image of Edessa, a legendary cloth bearing Christ's face that disappeared from Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade in 1204. Others suggest it was hidden by the Knights Templar. But here's the problem. There's zero documentation connecting those stories to the actual shroud we have today. The sudden appearance in medieval France, combined with the immediate accusations of fakery, gave skeptics plenty of ammunition. If it really wrapped Jesus, where was it for over 1,300 years? The 1988 radiocarbon bombshell. In 1988, the Vatican finally agreed to let scientists put the shroud to the ultimate test, radiocarbon dating. 3 independent laboratories in Oxford, Zurich, and Tucson each received postage stamp-sized samples from a corner of the cloth. The method works by measuring the decay of carbon-14 isotopes in organic material, providing an estimate of when the flax plants were harvested to make the linen. The results came back remarkably consistent across all 3 labs. The shroud dated to between 1260 and 1390 CE, right in the medieval period, with a 95% confidence level. The timing matched almost perfectly with its first appearance in Lirey. For many scientists and skeptics, the case was closed. Here was hard, objective data from the gold standard of archaeological dating. The cloth couldn't be from the time of Christ if the linen itself wasn't made until 13 centuries later. Major news outlets ran headlines declaring the shroud officially debunked. The scientific community largely moved on, considering it a fascinating medieval artifact rather than an ancient relic. But not everyone accepted these results as the final word, and the controversy was far from over. Pushback and problems with the carbon dating. Almost immediately, some researchers began questioning whether the 1988 test had actually measured the original cloth. The samples were taken from a single corner of the shroud, an area that has been handled, touched, and possibly repaired over centuries. A 2005 study by chemist Raymond Rogers examined threads from the sample area and claimed they showed evidence of cotton fibers and a different chemical signature than the main body of the cloth, suggesting medieval repairs with newer material. If true, the radiocarbon test would have dated the repair, not the original fabric. Other scientists proposed that centuries of handling, fire damage, including a fire in 1532 that nearly destroyed it, and bacterial contamination could have skewed the results by adding younger carbon to the sample. Some even suggested a bioplastic coating from bacteria could make ancient linen appear younger. Mainstream archaeologists mostly dismissed these objections, pointing out that radiocarbon labs routinely clean samples to remove such contamination, and that all three independent labs got the same medieval date. The scientific establishment generally still accepts the 1988 dating, but the persistence of these challenges kept the door open for new research, and believers never stopped looking for evidence that might overturn the medieval verdict. The 2024 Flax Study, Levantine Origins. Fast forward to 2024, when researchers published findings about the geographic origin of the flax used to make the shroud. By analyzing isotope signatures in the linen fibers, specifically looking at ratios of different elements absorbed from soil and water where the flax grew, they concluded the plant material most likely came from the western Levant region. That's the area covering modern Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. This was significant because it contradicted the assumption that a medieval European forger would have used locally available European flax. If the cloth originated in the Near East, it suggested a more complex history than a simple French forgery. Of course, this finding doesn't prove the shroud wrapped Jesus. Linen from the Levant was a trade commodity throughout history, and a medieval European could have acquired Eastern cloth for creating a convincing relic. What it does do is chip away at the neat medieval forgery narrative. It raises questions about how and why someone in 1300s France would go to the trouble of sourcing authentic Near Eastern linen if they were just making a fake. The study added another layer to an already complicated puzzle, showing that even if the cloth dates to medieval times, its materials might tell an older story. Wide-angle X-ray scattering, a 1st century fabric. In December 2024, another scientific paper dropped that sent ripples through both believer and skeptic communities. Researchers used a technique called wide-angle X-ray scattering to examine the aging patterns in the linen fibers themselves. This method looks at the natural degradation of cellulose in plant fibers over time, essentially reading the molecular breakdown as a kind of clock. Their conclusion was striking. The aging pattern they measured was more consistent with a 1st century origin than a medieval one. If validated, this would directly contradict the 1988 radiocarbon dating and place the cloth's creation right around the time of Christ. But here's where scientific caution comes in. The X-ray scattering technique for dating linen is newer and less established than radiocarbon dating. It requires assumptions about how the cloth was stored, what temperatures it experienced, and how various environmental factors affected fiber degradation over centuries. The shroud's known history includes being in a fire, stored in various conditions, and handled extensively, all variables that could throw off the aging estimates. Many archaeologists and dating specialists remain skeptical, arguing that radiocarbon dating is still the gold standard and shouldn't be overturned by a single study using a less proven method. The research has sparked debate rather than consensus, which seems to be the pattern with nearly every shroud study. The DNA evidence. What did genetic tests actually find? Perhaps no recent research got more sensational headlines than the DNA studies. Scientists extracted genetic material from dust particles vacuumed from the shroud's surface during previous examinations. They found DNA from multiple sources: human, plant, and bacterial. The human DNA came from multiple individuals, which isn't surprising given the cloth's history of being handled by countless people over centuries. The plant DNA was particularly interesting, showing species from various regions, including the Mediterranean and Middle East, though some were also found in Europe. Bacterial DNA revealed microorganisms found in soil from different areas. Some media reports trumpeted this as proof the shroud had been in Jerusalem, while others claimed the DNA was from a Semitic individual. But here's the reality. DNA analysis from dust on a cloth handled for centuries tells you more about its travel history than its origin. You can't extract DNA from the image itself, and the genetic material found could easily have come from any of the hundreds of people who touched, repaired, or examined the cloth over 7 centuries. A 2025 forensic science review specifically called out the overstatements in popular coverage, noting that genetic analysis simply cannot determine whether this cloth wrapped a specific person 2,000 years ago. The DNA evidence is interesting for understanding the shroud's history, but doesn't settle the authenticity question in either direction. Blood, pollen, and forensic red flags. The reddish-brown stains on the shroud that look like blood have been tested multiple times with conflicting results. Some tests detected compounds found in old blood, including iron oxide and proteins. Others found no biological blood markers, suggesting paint. Even if the stains are real blood, that doesn't prove age or authenticity. Medieval artists had access to blood too. Forensic pathologists have raised another problem with the stains. When they analyzed the flow patterns, something seemed off. Blood from a crucified body lying wrapped in cloth should spread and pool differently than what appears on the shroud. Some flows look too neat, too artistic, more like they were applied to match expectations of crucifixion wounds rather than actual blood from a corpse. Then there's the pollen evidence. Researchers have claimed to find pollen from plants native to Jerusalem embedded in the cloth fibers, including species that bloom in spring around Passover. This sounds compelling until you realize pollen is microscopic, travels on air currents, and could have been deposited during any of the shroud's many travels or while on display. Some botanists have also disputed the pollen identifications, claiming the samples were too degraded to definitively identify to species level. Like so much shroud evidence, the blood and pollen data can be interpreted to support either authenticity or forgery, depending on which expert you ask and what assumptions you're willing to make. The 3D imaging problem, art or miracle. One of the most fascinating aspects of the shroud has always been how the image appears three-dimensional when analyzed with certain techniques. Some researchers claimed this property would be impossible for a medieval artist to achieve, suggesting the image formed through some unknown process involving radiation or energy from a body. But in 2025, a Brazilian graphics expert named Cicero Moraes put that claim to the test using modern cloth draping simulations. Moraes created digital models showing what would happen if you draped linen over a human corpse versus over a low-relief sculpture. The results were revealing. When cloth drapes over a real three-dimensional face and body, it creates distortions. The cloth has to stretch over the nose, fold at the cheeks, gap at the neck. The image you'd get from transferring a pattern from that draped cloth onto a flat surface would look weirdly stretched and distorted, nothing like a natural face. But when Moraes simulated cloth over a shallow bas-relief sculpture, like a carved plaque with slightly raised features, the resulting image matched the shroud remarkably well. The proportions stayed natural. The three-dimensional appearance made sense. This suggested medieval artisans could have created the image using entirely known techniques without requiring any miraculous process. Of course, demonstrating something is possible doesn't prove it happened that way, but it does remove the argument that the image required supernatural explanation. So, is it real or fake? After all the tests, studies, and debates, where does that muqaddad leave us? The honest answer is we still don't know for certain. Here's what we can say with reasonable confidence. The cloth itself might be older or younger than the medieval period depending on which dating method you trust. The materials could have come from the Near East, which doesn't prove, but also doesn't disprove, authenticity. The image formation remains unexplained by any single definitive mechanism, though medieval artistic techniques remain plausible. The DNA tells us almost nothing definitive about origin, and the bloodstains raise as many questions as they answer. What we're left with is a case where nearly every piece of evidence can be interpreted multiple ways. Believers see an artifact that has withstood scientific scrutiny, with newer tests suggesting greater age than the 1988 carbon dating. Skeptics see a medieval object with properties entirely explainable through known historical techniques, with the carbon dating still the most reliable evidence. The scientific community largely leans toward the medieval explanation, but enough uncertainty remains to keep researchers investigating. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about the shroud isn't what it proves, but that after so much scrutiny, it still manages to resist a simple, universally accepted explanation. Whether that's because it's genuinely ancient and mysterious, or because humans are remarkably good at seeing what they want to see and ambiguous evidence remains an open question. The Shroud of Turin continues to occupy a strange space between faith and science, history and mystery. Recent DNA analysis and advanced testing techniques haven't delivered the definitive answer headlines promised. Instead, they've added more data to an already complex puzzle where every answer seems to generate new questions. What we can say is this: the Shroud remains one of the most studied artifacts in human history, and whether it's a sacred relic or an ingenious medieval creation, it's certainly one of the most successful at capturing human imagination. The mystery, it seems, endures. It may